The Oasis, written by E.G. Rand. It had been a busy night at the county morgue. Reggie snapped off his rubber gloves, groaned. The gray-green of the fluorescent lights made him nauseous. He was the only coroner in 3 counties, and bodies piled up fast. It was hard to get all the autopsies done, but the overtime was good, and Reggie wanted to help that poor blonde Jane Doe. Reggie's years of morgue work had not hardened his heart. He always felt for the families of the people he examined. He wanted to give them answers. Reggie pushed his cowboy hat up to mop his brow. Just a few more hours, and he'd be on the road in his camper. Reggie checked the stock of formaldehyde, skin lotions, hair conditioners. He tried not to think about the day's work, that strange girl's body, so well preserved on the outside and so long rotten within. Instead, Reggie thought about the long weekend he had planned, taking the camper trailer out to the country for some fishing. Maybe go check out that commune a few towns over that everyone's been tittering about. See how free that free love was. Reggie double-checked the freezer. 5 neatly shrouded bodies, each on its own shelf. He turned off the light and latched the freezer and left the autopsy room to file his paperwork. He wanted to get a description of the Jane Doe to the police before he went camping. A metallic bang rang through the tile room. Reggie turned to see the freezer door thrown open. He strode into the freezer, flicked on the light, and quickly counted the bodies. 4. Reggie backed up, mouth agape, and felt something sharp pointing into his back. "Hi there." A voice, female, southern and rusty with disuse. The tip of the knife pressed further, through his thin scrubs and into his skin. "I like that hat." The voice was cold, smelled of death. "I think I'm gonna take that with me." The Oasis was used to visiting strangers. People came from all over to see what the commune was about, to try roughing it in the wild, or just to get away from modern society. Some of those visitors decided to stay and become permanent residents, but most got tired of the rustic campground and moved on. The Oasis was enjoying a mild summer, rooted deep in rolling heartland. But summer brought a knife in its bouquet. Tornadoes were a constant threat to the commune. Despite existing for almost a decade, the Oasis was slow in development. Should they be struck by a tornado, their only hope was an abandoned farm with a basement over 3 miles away. There was only one person in the big open-air camp kitchen as dawn broke. Now that she had no children to take care of, April could not stand being in her camper longer than necessary. Each dawn was a reminder of what she lost. The sky was tepid yellow and gray as April lit a fire in the large stone stove and began grinding coffee beans fished out of a town dumpster. The commune members did a lot of dumpster diving, sometimes traveling for hours to do so. April always marveled at the things people would throw away. The sun was just beginning to peer over the horizon, casting the Oasis's large teepee in a strange glow, lighting the images of a buffalo running across purple mountain majesty. The teepee was the Oasis's official meeting place and had been purchased from the local indigenous tribe, who had politely declined the Oasis's offer of membership. White Buffalo, a newer garden member, walked from around the great tent and entered the kitchen. April said good morning, but White Buffalo ignored her. She was a tall woman with dirty blonde dreadlocks, her lean face and body covered with amateur tattoos, sigils, symbols, and pot leaves. She looked like a study hall desk. White Buffalo titled herself the spiritual leader of the Oasis. She claimed to be in contact with the ethereal realm, speaking in gibberish she called the language of light. April didn't think she would last long. Her type never did. They tended to get on people's nerves before drifting off in search of a spiritual following. April flicked on the radio, which bleated to life in the middle of a news broadcast. A strange case turns stranger in Plattsville when a coroner is killed and a body of an unidentified woman stolen from the county morgue. The woman had been found in a creek bed in Blackburn Park 3 days ago. White Buffalo glared at April, who changed the radio to an oldies rock station. April wondered what she was doing, cooking breakfast and catering to White Buffalo's whims. It wasn't even April's turn to make breakfast. The chart said today was Sage's turn for kitchen duty. April pretended to be annoyed, but she knew she couldn't fight the compulsion to stay busy. Besides, the commune needed to be fed. Sage was young and had only been at the commune for a month. She seemed more interested in taking pictures of the Oasis for social media than participating in any work. She was another one that April thought would leave before the cold came. Other members began to trickle in, taking up familiar seats. There was Uncle Stogie, a lifelong hippie and nomad in his 60s. He was followed by Tyrone, a military vet and avid outdoorsman, the only halfway decent hunter the Oasis had to offer. Sage finally stumbled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed, touting her phone and reluctantly helping April serve eggs and coffee. The longtime Oasis residents found the social media presence to be annoying at best and invasive at worst. But no one could deny the amount of money it brought in, which had paid for the teepee, among other things. Sage was good at getting people to donate. Clover and Gemini, the Oasis's longest residents and de facto leaders, were the last to arrive with their 2 girls in tow. Lily, 6, and Crocus, 8. Clover went to help April with breakfast, but Gemini sat down heavily at one of the picnic tables. His long, dark hair was unkempt, his eyes red. He had been up all night with Lily, who had an ear infection that they were trying to treat with garlic. The commune was just beginning to file over to the teepee for the morning meeting when an approaching vehicle was spotted. The Oasis sat high on a hill, surrounded by a donut of forest that gave away to plains all around. Anyone driving the long length of the road was headed to the Oasis. It had been a while since a new person arrived. The commune was interested, some getting binoculars for a better look. It was a nondescript truck towing an old teardrop camper. Inwardly, Gemini sighed with relief. Too often people arrived at the Oasis with nothing but a dream and a leaky tent. Whoever it was, at least they had their own roof. The entire commune greeted the newcomer as the truck squealed to a halt in a cloud of dust. A woman stepped out, shaking a head full of blonde hair from under a cowboy hat and flashing the crowd a toothy smile. "She's like an angel," muttered Tyrone. No one disagreed. The woman was striking. She had open features, bright teeth, and a smattering of freckles across her nose that stood starkly against her pale skin, like drops of henna on a white parchment. "Hi, y'all!" she shouted. She wore practical clothes, jean shorts, and a large black t-shirt with work boots. Yet she looked like she had walked off the cover of a magazine. The woman introduced herself as Julia, as calm and cool as a statue. In a lilting southern drawl, Julia told them she wasn't planning to stay at the Oasis long term. She was on a solo trip. She had heard about the Oasis, seemed like a nice place to camp for a few days. Gemini disapproved of tourists, but he found that he could not turn Julia away. There was something irresistible about this woman. It was not just her good looks or her charming southern accent. Julia was self-possessed. She was insular. Gemini knew that if he sent her away, it would be their loss, not hers. Clover, stepping in for her dumbstruck husband, told Julia where she could park her truck and camper in an area near the forest. Tyrone and Uncle Stogie went along with her to help set up. Just like that, Julia Morningstar was in the Oasis. The commune awoke to find that all their chickens were dead. There was no evidence of an animal attack, no bloody feathers or half-eaten carcasses. The chickens had dropped whole, unblemished except for their black eyes. On each hen and rooster, the eyes had exploded like overripe elderberries in the sun. No one blamed Julia for the chickens, at least not at first. Livestock didn't do well out in Coyote Country, and Julia quickly found ways to make herself a useful addition to the Oasis. She gave Clover antibiotics for her daughter's ear infection. She gave Uncle Stogie a thick cream for his eczema, which cleared up his skin but had a vaguely antiseptic smell he didn't like. What made Julia the most popular was her large stash of cannabis, one of the few intoxicants allowed in the Oasis. She shared this bounty freely, quickly becoming a favorite. In fact, everyone took to Julia in those first 3 days. Everyone except April. At first, April assumed her distaste of Julia was simply catty dislike. It took a full day for April's thoughts on Julia to crystallize. She didn't dislike Julia because she was new and pretty. April disliked Julia because she was creepy. There was something wrong with Julia, something deeply anomalous. Her sky blue eyes had a glazed, doll-like quality that April found unsettling. Julia didn't seem to blink. Her pupils didn't dilate. She had an unnerving habit of staring over her shoulder, as if she expected to be followed. And that smell. Underneath the skunky sweet smell of weed, Julia had a terrible chemical smell. April tried to stay away from her, but Julia seemed to be everywhere. Once or twice, Julia caught April's eye. On these occasions, Julia would smirk at her, as if they shared some dirty secret. It made April's skin crawl. Unbeknownst to her, April wasn't the only person who found Julia disturbing. White Buffalo had been trying to form a secret alliance to oust the new visitor ever since the chickens died. "I saw her near the chicken coop that night," White Buffalo hissed to Sage as they lay by a stream in the forest. "Oh?" said Sage, crunching on an apple, eyes glued to her phone. "Did you actually see her, or was it a vision thingy?" "I actually saw her," White Buffalo spat. "I came out of my tent to go to the outhouse, and I saw her lurking around the chicken coop. She was looking at the chickens with this big red candle. Get this, there was a huge crow on the coop, and Julia was talking to it." "She was talking to a crow?" asked Sage, eyebrows raised. "Yes," said White Buffalo. "She kept calling it Mr. Morningstar. I'm telling you, she was performing dark magic. When she blew out the red candle, it went all dark, except her eyes. Her eyes sort of stayed. The next day, the chickens were all dead." "The chickens have all died like twice since I've been here," sighed Sage. "How do you know that the crow didn't do it? Maybe Julia was trying to shoo it away and it came back after she left." White Buffalo, furious at being questioned, began to sputter about the messages she received from her lightworkers and spirits. Sage put her phone away. Deep down, Sage was suspicious of Julia too. She didn't like her still eyes or her awful chemical smell, but the Oasis took in all sorts of weirdos and strange smells were part of the deal. "She's a dark spirit," White Buffalo continued. "My guide said I've got to do my live stream. See you later." Before White Buffalo could stop her, Sage had disappeared down the path back to the camp. Feeling that a prophet was not revered in her own land, White Buffalo began walking back. She was just about to pass the tree line when she spotted someone behind a large oak, crouched down and peering into the camp like a hunted animal. It was April. "What are you doing?" she whispered, making April jump. Her face was pale, her eyes like dinner plates. White Buffalo thought she looked scared shitless. Through the trees, they could clearly see Julia's teardrop camper, empty. April fumbled for an explanation. She had no reason to be spying on Julia. Yet here she was, trying to see how the strange woman acted when she was alone. Now that she was confronted, her brain froze. April and White Buffalo were so busy that neither of them heard Julia approach. "Looking for me?" Now it was White Buffalo's turn to jump. She threw herself back against April. The two women stared at Julia, who smiled placidly from under the cowboy hat she never seemed to take off. She fixed the women with her glassy blue eyes, one after the other, and cut right to the chase. "You two don't seem to like me very much. Why is that?" Julia took a step towards them, and April was assailed by that strange, acrid smell. "My spirit guides told me you were dangerous," blurted White Buffalo. Julia laughed. It sounded like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin lid. "Did they now? My goodness." She peeled her lips back, revealing white teeth anchored in blue-gray gums. "I saw you kill those chickens," White Buffalo shouted. April looked shocked. This was the first she had heard of this, but Julia just shrugged. "You saw me standing near the chickens? How do you think I killed them? With my mind?" Julia chuckled. "I'm just passing through. I won't hurt you." April thought that was a weird way of saying she meant no harm. White Buffalo had accused Julia of killing chickens. No one said they thought Julia would hurt them. "I'm headed back to my husband soon." Julia sighed. She was an arm's length from the women now. The smell made April's eyes water. She wanted desperately to get away from this foul woman, but she was rooted to the spot. "You're married?" White Buffalo asked. "Well, yes," said Julia. Her cheerful persona fell all at once, like a curtain dropping. "Yes, I am married. I owe everything to my husband, Mr. Morningstar. He gave me my life back." Julia's face held the form of a smile like a wrinkle in a bedsheet. "Mr. Morningstar wants me to come home. He doesn't like me wandering, doesn't like me doing much of anything except staying with him, but I think I might stay just a little while longer." April found this idea terrifying. "I think you should leave." April's voice was shaky. She was terrified, but she felt an animal urge to take a stand against this woman. "I think you should go back to your husband." "Is that so?" "Yes, we both think—" White Buffalo started, but Julia cut her off. "White Buffalo?" she chuckled. "Such a stupid, sanctimonious name. April, did you know her real name? It's Clarabelle Smith. She was born to a waitress in Madison, Wisconsin. She read the name White Buffalo in a blog." White Buffalo, or Clara, looked like she had been smacked. Julia continued. "You know something? It doesn't surprise me that you formed this little club. The two of you got more in common than you think." "Oh?" April croaked. "Why, yes. You're both childless mothers." April nearly screamed. No one would have told Julia about her children being taken. White Buffalo's mouth hung open, her eyes white as a startled horse. Julia continued, her face turned upwards as if discussing the weather. "Couple of bad mommies you are. Clarabelle, do you remember that little boy you gave up for adoption 3 years ago? Well, turns out no one wanted him. He ended up in a foster home. Not one of the good ones, either. Sitting in a crib all day with shit in his diaper while you run around and blather on." White Buffalo dropped to her knees, horrified. Julia rounded on April. "And you? Your children are certainly faring better. In fact, they love living with their daddy and new mommy. Did you know they call her mommy? They have a nice little life away from you. They don't ask about you anymore. They don't remember your face." "Stop it!" Hot tears warped April's vision. She saw only Julia's white grin. White Buffalo, or whatever her name was, lay as a crying heap on the earth. April fled. She didn't know she was running until she was halfway across the field back to camp. Back in the dark woods, Julia placed a hand on White Buffalo's heaving back. It was ice cold. She knelt down beside the stunned woman. "I ain't going nowhere," whispered Julia. "I like this commune, and I think I'm going to stay a while. But my husband gets lonely, and the chickens weren't enough. He is always more amenable to my wandering if I send him some company." Julia held the crying woman steady in a cold grip. With the other hand, Julia reached for the knife she kept in her boot. Gemini, Tyrone, and a few of the other members sweated under the hot sun. They were digging a trench for the water pipe. The going was slow, and everyone was miserable. Gemini especially. They had spent a fortune replacing the chickens and hours burning the bodies to avoid contamination. On top of that, he hadn't been sleeping well the past few nights. Lily was finally better, but now Gemini was plagued by bad dreams. Dreams of tornadoes and firestorms. Tyrone was also drained. He was no stranger to sleepless nights, having suffered severe PTSD since his time in the army. But what he was not used to was the strange sounds he had been hearing outside of his tent. Something was sniffing around, something much bigger than a raccoon or even a coyote. He was sure that whatever it was, it had killed the chickens, maybe frightened them to death. Everyone on the work team was tense and exhausted, so when April came flying up the hill in hysterics, no one was interested in hearing her story. By the time they got her to calm down enough to explain what had happened, Tyrone and Gemini were already dismissing her versions of events. "So she was rude to White Buffalo, so what?" grunted Tyrone, throwing dirt over his shoulder as he spoke. "I think we all got tired of that language of light shit." "That's not it!" howled April, her face a twisted mask of rage and grief. "She mocked me for losing my children!" Gemini and Tyrone looked at each other. The removal of April's children had been a traumatic event for the whole community. The police had arrived, pulled the little boy and girl screaming from their mother's arms. It was no surprise that April was sensitive about it. But Gemini did not fly to April's defense, nor did he offer to call a community meeting about it. He didn't even suggest that they go to the woods to do conflict management between White Buffalo and Julia. He told April that Julia wouldn't be at the Oasis much longer anyway. She said so herself. Gemini hoped that was enough to defuse the situation. It wasn't. Rumors spread around the Oasis like disease. In a matter of hours, it was all anyone was talking about. April had taken to her camper, refusing to come to the kitchen for dinner. Clover went to check on her but could not coax her out. As for White Buffalo, she had disappeared entirely. Her campsite with its new age trappings of crystals and incense sat empty. Julia did not seem concerned. She shrugged off questions about the confrontation, handed out joints and pushed the food around her plate. But now Julia's good spirits felt glib. White Buffalo was missing and April was traumatized. White Buffalo was a relative newcomer, but April was not. An unease wrapped around Julia as thick as smoke. At dusk, a search party had gone out to look for White Buffalo, led by Sage. All they found was a single dreadlock floating in the creek like a dead snake, caked in dirt and what looked like blood. By nightfall, everyone was worried. Gemini and Clover sat in their converted school bus camper, watching their girls color before bedtime. Clover disapproved of how Gemini handled April and Julia's confrontation. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Gemini felt the resentment coming off of her in waves. "Daddy! Daddy!" It took several seconds for Gemini to realize that Lily was trying to get his attention. "Today I gave Auntie Julia a drawing, and she said—" "Auntie?" said Clover, bolting upright. "Yeah, she told us to call her that. Anyway, I drew her a picture, but when she leaned over to take it, I saw she had a big boo-boo on her chest." A big boo-boo? Asked Gemini. Why did she tell you to call her auntie? Asked Clover. She told us she was going to stay here for a long time, so we should call her auntie, chimed in Crocus. Lily continued. The boo-boo was so bad, Mommy. She has a big cut that goes like this. Lily traced one finger from shoulder to shoulder, then down her sternum in a Y shape. I asked her what happened, and she said that I should go and play. Gemini's mouth went dry. Clover looked nauseated. Before they could say anything, the door to the bus flew open. Sage tumbled into the room, panting. Gemini leapt to his feet, enraged at the intrusion, but stopped short when he saw her face. Sage held up her phone. It was a normal video blog, Sage in her tent, talking about the camp's new compost toilet. She greets someone off camera, and the tent flap opens. Julia ducks into frame. For a moment, Julia's face, still, beautiful, smiling, looks into the camera. Then a loud buzzing filled the bus. It was like a swarm of angry bees, louder than a phone should be able to produce. Crocus and Lily screamed, clamping their hands over their ears. Just before Sage could turn the video off, Gemini could see that the image of Julia's face was monstrously distorted. Her eyes were black smears, her smile turned down into a scream. All the videos with Julia are like that, she whispered. Tyrone tossed and turned in his tent. The tent was large but not huge, just enough space to stand in. Usually the ground kept him cool, but tonight the tent felt like a big plastic bag. It was more than the heat. The still air didn't feel right. The Oasis was a place of constant noise. You could hear RVs running, dogs barking, babies crying. Now it was still, silent, like someone had dropped a big glass lid over his tent, leaving him to boil alive. Someone tapped at his tent flap. Tyrone immediately thought of Uncle Stogie, who also suffered from insomnia. Without hesitation, Tyrone rolled off his bed mat and unzipped the tent. He was eye to eye with White Buffalo. Tyrone saw the open wound that crossed her throat from ear to ear. In the moonlight, the slash grinned at him like a second mouth, the layers of flesh displayed like a medical anatomy. Blood had mixed with the mud that covered her, but there was no blood spilling from the wound. White Buffalo was drained dry. A chunk of dreadlocks had been ripped from her temple, the exposed flesh packed with mud. Her eyes were filmed bluish white. Like a marionette, White Buffalo's mouth dropped open, and a terrible sound emanated from her throat. Screaming, human screaming, the sound Tyrone had heard so many times on the battlefield. The sound of soldiers being burned alive, crushed under rubble, ripped in half. Under it all, there was a second voice. This one was smooth, calm even. It was not White Buffalo's voice. It was a man's voice, a man in charge, a man who wanted to help. He seemed to speak directly into Tyrone's mind, whispering into his consciousness while his mind withered in panic. Come, Tyrone. Come outside and help me send a message. Clover and Gemini, sleeping with the girls in bed, were jolted awake by screaming. Gemini told Clover to wait with the girls. He pulled on his jacket and ran outside. It was just before dawn, but the sky hung heavy with steel-gray clouds. Hot wind whipped across his face as Gemini ran towards the source of the sound. A crowd had gathered in front of the teepee. They turned to look at him as he approached, and Gemini's stomach dropped. Tyrone stood naked and shivering in front of the massive triangular tent. His eyes bulged, staring at something no one else could see. When Gemini shoved to the front, Tyrone reacted. He locked eyes with Gemini and slowly raised his right hand. Tyrone's index and middle fingers had been clipped off at the second knuckle. Blood poured from the wound, sluicing to the ground in black waves. Gemini saw the words that were painted all over the teepee in blood. Come home, come home, come home, come home, come home. Gemini snapped out of his daze. He ordered Uncle Stogie to get the medical kit and to wrap Tyrone in a blanket. Together, he and Uncle Stogie carefully guided Tyrone to the kitchen, sitting him down at the table. He moved like a zombie. The commune, a flock of whispers, stood in the kitchen and stared at the injured man. When the medical kit arrived, Gemini got to work bandaging Tyrone's hand. Sage broke from the crowd to whisper to Gemini. "It's Julia," hissed Sage. "There is something wrong with her." "I'm inclined to agree," said Uncle Stogie, glancing at Gemini. "This all started when Julia arrived." A clear, sing-song voice cut through the crowd. "Why, this is the second time I have walked in on a conversation about myself." Julia stood in the kitchen, smiling pertly, her cowboy hat not moving in the rising wind. The gray clouds overhead began to darken and swirl ominously. Fat drops of rain fell like bullets on the tin roof. Sage spoke first. "We think you should leave," she half shouted. There was a murmur of assent among the group. "We?" said Julia, politely puzzled. "We? Sage, do you speak for the group?" Sage, put on the spot, sputtered. She looked at Gemini for reassurance. Rain began to pelt the roof harder. Julia smiled, revealing her putrid gums. "Of course you speak for the group. You've never had an original thought in your life." Tyrone lunged forward, pushing aside Uncle Stogie. The blanket whipped away in the wind, and for a moment it looked as if Tyrone would strike Julia. Instead, he spit on the ground before her, a mass of phlegm and blood covering his own 2 severed fingers. "Come home." The voice did not come from Tyrone. It seemed to come from all around them, from the whistling wind. Leaves and rain began to whip against the kitchen. It was surely morning, but no sun shone. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, slowly turning to green. Julia was no longer smiling. Her face was stiff, her skin even whiter than before. "No," she whispered. She looked around her, from face to face, the realization that she might be thrown out dawning on her. "No, no, listen, don't make me go. I'm not ready to go back to him." A bolt of lightning, deafeningly loud, struck the ground by the kitchen. People screamed and thunder rolled through the hilltop. The rain was coming down in buckets along with huge chunks of hail. Just beyond Julia's frightened face, Gemini could see the rainwater dripping off the teepee, the greenish skies, and the telltale funnel of an approaching tornado. Gemini panicked. He thought of his children in the bus, the commune. People screamed and began to scatter. The wind whistled a freight train scream, and Gemini wondered frantically if they had enough time to make it to the farm basement. A howl rendered through the air. It was April. Dirty and red-eyed, she looked feral. You did this!" She screamed at Julia through the wind. Julia stepped back, looking genuinely afraid for the first time since entering the Oasis. She looked out at the storm, her mouth forming pleas whipped away. The wind was now full of strange chanting, audible over the scream of the tornado, which would soon be right above them. "Come home, come home, come home, come home, come home, come home." There was another bolt of lightning, followed by a deafening crack. The teepee had been struck. The main tent pole twisted and fell. The whole thing was blackened and burning, filling the air with smoke. But still, Julia stood, resolute, refusing to move. In a flash of lightning, Gemini saw April run forward. She shoved Julia with all her might, pushing her out of the kitchen and into the storm.
You can have her! Take her back!
Julia's face went from fear to horror as she lay in the mud, skin white against the darkness. For just a moment, time stopped. Then the wind seemed to grab Julia. Julia opened her mouth in a silent scream as she was lifted from the ground. She turned her head, and without the cowboy hat on, Gemini could see the large black-stitched incision that ran across the back of Julia's scalp, directly above her white neck. The wind screamed, pulling Julia higher, lifting her by her hair like a doll. The cut on her scalp strained. The wind lifted Julia's shirt, and Gemini could see the Y-shaped scars his daughter had described. The incision was being slowly pulled apart by the wind. One by one, the black stitches began to break. They pinged away like bullet casings, pulling open her hollow body. With a final scream, the autopsy scar was ripped open. A mass of rotting viscera splattered across the earth. Now Julia was nothing but a body blue-green from rot. The empty corpse swung in a localized tornado, its limp flesh flapping wildly, blonde hair, white teeth, glassy eyes. As suddenly as it started, the tornado stopped. Julia's remains fell to the ground with a wet thud, a sickening heap of rotting, ribboned flesh. But Gemini found that the worst was yet to come. Something tugged at the pile of viscera. Invisible hands gathered the ribbons of flesh, pulled the rotting entrails. They picked up speed, the remains of Julia being pulled under bushes and into trees, slithering away from the commune like so many fetid snakes. Julia's husband got her home, one way or another.